Alright, here we go. Welcome to the Art Critique. Today's is gonna be for the boss that I faced last stream but didn't manage to have time to art critique because I was so engrossed in talking about the strategies for it. The Telperion! And let's go! So, disclaimers as usual. I'm gonna only slightly talk about the game design. This is not an in-depth discussion, that's another discipline. And also, the way this critique is gonna go is through Feldman's method, description, analysis, interpretation, and judgment. I'm gonna describe what I see in the description, talk about the elements of art on the analysis, interpret the creative vision in the interpretation, and basing myself on the principles of art, I'm going to call this a successful or unsuccessful work of art on the judgment step. So with all that said, let's begin. Description, what do I... oh my god, this is silly, but ta-da! Just, you know, make things look a little bit easier for us to analyze, for you to see specifically. For me, I think it doesn't change anything. Whatever. Description, what do I see? So... much like for Laurelin, right? The boss the Telperion is based on, kinda, alternate version. This is some sort of tree-like thing, right? It has like some cut off parts of it with these patterns that are typical of trees and stuff. Although this one looks a bit... it has some spikes to it. So, by the way, it's raining, let me close the windows so to help with the noise. There we go. In case there's thunder. Anyway, there are also a lot of cobwebs. So, what else? And other than that, it's this sort of rotund thing. Some sort of rotund tree that's alive, right? Moving. Has this very notable big hole in it. What else? And yeah, and it's being lifted off the ground. So what else could I say for the description? I think that's it. Let's move on to the analysis. Elements of art. I'm gonna be considering 8 points, lines, shapes, forms, space, texture, color, and value. So let's begin with points. Let's see here. Points, we have a few black ones here on the spikes, which to me look a little bit like tying a bit to the texture and or the forms of the spikes. We're gonna get to those later. There is also some that refer a bit to texture, to me look a little bit like textures and or value, but not necessarily. Anything else? Over here also. And here these points are a bit lighter. I think that's mostly it. Pretty easily you are gonna see points being used as a complementary to texture, light, sometimes forms, texture, value, sometimes forms. Value is light and darkness, but yeah. So, but what I can say about this point is that they are, most of them are black, although I think there are some lighter ones here. And they are kind of grouped. There's like a bunch of ones here and here and here on the spikes, and I think that's mostly it. There's usually not too much to talk about when it comes to points, without talking about value, texture, stuff like that. Let's move on to lines. So for lines here, it's so good to see a work of art with lines like Team Fortress 2, which is so common. There's so commonly a lack of it. So it's good to see something different. The lines to me in general do not seem to be very thick. And there's a lot of curvature to many of them, especially for example on the branches of the tree. On this part here, a lot of curvature in it. There's also on the spikes, the edgy part of the spikes makes for edges on the curves, on the lines. Sorry. Here also. What else? But those are like basically black lines. Because for the cobwebs, we see white lines. They're mostly straight. They're not perfectly straight, I feel like, but they're relatively straight. For the cobwebs, and what else? And also the thickness of lines in general, all of them are pretty regular. These lines are, you don't see very much variance, let's say, between a line gets thicker than thicker thin, stuff like that. That was not a choice by the author. Thickness regularity, and that goes also for the sharper lines on the spikes. And even the cobwebs, to me it seems like they have a somewhat of a similar what's the name of it? Similar thickness than all lines in general. So yeah, that's my analysis on lines. Let's talk about the shapes now. By the way, shapes and forms, if you don't want to mix those up, shapes are always two-dimensional in an art. When it comes to the elements of art, forms are always three-dimensional. For shapes here, let's see. Again, there's curvature to the shapes, much like there was for the lines. For many of them, we have this somewhat of a circular shape-ish for the body of the Telperion. We have the slender shapes for the branches. Not that slender, right? Some of them are slender, some of them are thicker. But yeah, we have these like branching, protruding shapes for the protruding like lengthy and tube-like shapes. Tubes are two-dimensional, but anyway. What else? Also for the spikes, edged shapes for the spikes, as you can imagine. What else? Also another circular shape here for the stumps, the hole. The hole is more oval, I guess, but still. And the many details of the cut-off parts of the branches, I guess, also are either circular or oval in their shapes. What else? Yeah, I guess that's mostly it for shapes. So, circles, like branches, thin branches stuff, although some are a bit thicker, and the spikes. So that's it for shapes. Let's talk about forms. So for the forms of the Telperion, we'll get again something kind of spherical for the body of it, and this time I can say tube-like, branch-like forms for the branches, with curvature again. What else? For the spikes, they are kind of conic. They're not by far not perfect cones, not perfect cones, but a number of them have like some conic-like forms to them. And then there's the spiky point of it naturally. What else for forms? A lot of protruding forms for the many cut-off parts, the stumps, and a hollow one for the whole hollow form there. And I think that's mostly it for forms. If we're gonna add the cobweb would be basically a very thin, like line, string-like forms there. So there's that. So let's move on to space. For the space, there is some use of space here. Let's say it's not that generous, but not that tight either underneath the Telperion, and something similar inside the hole, somewhat of a gaping hole, but at the same time, it's still limited in size. I would say the size of the hole, and thus the use of space there. So moderate use of space, let's say, for underneath the Telperion and the hole. And beside that, it's mostly open, right, around the Telperion itself. Like, there are specific spots, like a bit of tightness between the spikes here or there, or here between this little small detail of the branch. But those are minors, I would say. It's mostly open, like around the Telperion on many parts of it. The tighter spaces are like the exception. And as I said, the gaping hole and then their side are like moderate in the use of space, and that's probably the most noticeable use of space here. At least it is to me. Let's talk about texture. That texture is going to be an interesting element here because there's a lot of textures going on here. We have like these rugged textures for the surface of the Telperion, of the tree and the branches and stuff. We have the pattern textures for the cut off parts, the stumps. We have this for the bones. I guess we could call it like a bone-like texture for the spikes, something like that, and also tying to the dots, to the points, as I said on the first element here that I was talking about. I also wasn't talking about the earth, but I guess there's also like this dirty granulated texture for the earth near the branches of the Telperion that are lifting it. Anything else for the textures? So a lot of the different textures in different places. Very cool. I think that's mostly it. I don't think the cobwebs have enough detail to communicate to say there's a texture there. At least personally, I believe so. I think that's it. So a lot of rugged textures, pattern textures, bony-like textures, and granulated, dirty-like textures for the earth. It's not even that dirty, this earth, but maybe a bit, I guess. That's it for textures. Let's talk about color. Color, this one is easy. There's a very clear color identity, I would call. For the Telperion, it's like this dark shade of brown on most parts of it, which basically is the color of the bark of the Telperion, I would say, if this is a tree, right? After that, we have like white for the spikes and another different shade of white or beige for the cut-off parts and the stumps. Some light brown for the earth underneath the Telperion, and that's it, I would say. And I guess white for the cobwebs, although I already mentioned it before when I was talking about the element of lines. I guess that's it. And finally, the last element of art here to talk about is the element of value, which is about light and darkness, shadiness and brightness. If you were thinking about like this part here when I was talking about color, now we're gonna talk about it, because I would say this is more an element of ties more to the element of value. So this part here and the underneath, the underside parts and the back of it are the darker parts of the Telperion. We can clearly see shadows there. And the whole, it seems to me to be the most intense shadows the darker shadows there. When it comes to the other parts of the Telperion are the brighter parts, so the front of the Telperion, let's say, this part here, and also there is light being reflected on the spikes. There are like some parts with a little bit more intense brightness, a little bit like this part here, but not sure it's that noticeable, so I don't know. It's there, but I'm not sure how. Not sure if you should. How easy it is to see it, like as I said. What else? There's also some shadows behind the spike, for example, and underneath these ones, but these ones are more mild shadows. And at the same time, there is the spike on the back of it, which is like shader, because it's on the back of it, it's a darker part. So that's mostly it, I guess, for my analysis on value. Shades underneath and behind and inside the hole, mild shades underneath and behind, and a little bit darker on the hole itself, brighter on the other parts in general, and maybe there's a little bit more of something shiny on some of the spikes, but not too much of it, I would say. That's mostly it. So now let's move on to the interpretation step of the art critique. So what's the creative vision as I interpret it? First things first, let's begin with the obvious. This is Telperion, the boss for the game Epic Battle Fantasy 5. So, considering the context and stuff, that's easily gonna be my first idea to add to my interpretation here, for this to be a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy 5. An enemy, a boss. After that, let's see, moving on from that, so there is also everything that we said on the description and the analysis, talking about the many details of it. I'm going to say that the idea of a tree was important for the creative vision here. Not only did we mention a lot of traits of a tree, the bark, if you see it, it's kind of a tree, and there's the bark, the stumps, the roots, I guess these are roots, right? I was talking about branches, but these probably are the roots of it from everything that we're looking at. So the roots, the branches, so a lot of traits of a tree from the description, and also is to look at it through the analysis. And also, I haven't read it, but I believe Telperion is a reference to a tree in the Tolkien universe, Lord of the Rings. I believe that's a reference. I read it on the wiki once, I think. And so all of that makes me think that an important part of the creative vision was for this to be a tree for this boss, And let's see how well that was communicated later on. After that, considering the cobwebs and the spikes, and perhaps the darker shade of brown for the wood, especially if you want to compare it to the Laurelin. I believe the idea of this to be... and also the context where we fight this boss. If you think about the game design, we fight this boss inside of a kind of a zombie dungeon, right? With a lot of spooky enemies, and there is like zombies and stuff as NPCs. And so all that said, considering all of that, I believe the feelings of fear, basically horror and being something spooky, scary, was important for the creative vision here, for this to be a spooky, scary enemy, tree, boss. What else? There is also, if we think about game design and the lore, there's the fact and the battle when we fight this boss. This is the hidden hideout of the Ninja Cat Gang, so there's a bunch of cat ninjas inside. Can I show the cat ninja here? Here, cat ninja. These very evasive cats will coordinate their efforts to poison and assassinate the weakest player. They don't do that exactly, I think, when we fight the Telperion, but anyway. Yeah, there's that. The fact that this is a ninja hideout, ninja cat gang hideout. So would I add that to the interpretation here for the creative vision? I guess I ought to, right? Considering that, so not only it is a tree, something a boss for a BF5, a tree, something scary, some sort of house or hideout for the ninja cat gang. Okay, easy one. There's also the fact that when we look specifically, more specifics, like attacks with powerful bio, dark and bomb skills and gets 2 turns. All that stuff I think we could tie to the idea of the hideout of a ninja cat gang. Maybe the bio we could tie to being when I say tie, like I'm thinking about if we should add another idea for the creative vision interpretation. So some of these things I think could be already a part of the idea of the hideout of ninja cat gang, if I'm going to use this information for interpreting stuff here. I think that's how I'm going to do it. Considering this information as like tools that the ninja cat gang would use, and thus I'm not gonna say that this was part of the vision was that it would use bio, dark and bomb skills. I guess I could, but you know, I'm gonna be considering it inside of the ninja cat gang hideout idea. If I'm gonna look at elemental resistance and stuff, maybe that could tell us something. It's weak to fire, wind, holy, and bio. I think those, especially the fire and the bio, work together with the interpretation of this being a tree. Wind could be just the fact that this is like lifted, suspended. Not sure if I would add another idea for the creative vision to consider that information. I guess I ought to. No, I don't know. At one point it gets kind of weird. I could, but I don't know, because we have enemies, for example, like, let me see, the big lava slime. It's weak to dark. Why? Or like, was there a creative vision tying to it? You know, or are we getting just into game design? I don't know. Sometimes I think there is some reasonable logic to add to the interpretation, sometimes not. In this case, I'm not sure I would go that far. Again, maybe a different art critic would. And maybe the holy, we could tie to the idea of being scary. I could also turn things around, I guess, but like look first at the game design and then at the visuals, but I'd rather do as I did it and look first at the visuals and then look at the game design to see supporting information. Although now that I think about it, I don't know, maybe there's some very valid logics for looking at the game design first. Wow. Oh well, maybe on a future art critique, because I have already interpreted things like that. Let's just not redo everything, right? Let's just move on with what I have so far. So I think that's good enough for an interpretation anyway. But I'm definitely gonna think about this idea of looking at the game design first and the visuals second. It's hard to say. It's like both should kind of work together, you know. But anyway, so the 4 ideas that I'm gonna be considering for my interpretation of the creative vision. For this to be a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy 5, for this to be a tree, for this to be scary, spooky, and for this to be a hideout for the Ninja Cat Gang. And if you want to, maybe we could also add the idea of this to be something lifted, suspended, so that would justify the wind weakness, but I don't know. And I don't think I want to go over on the other stats and stuff. I think that's that adds a bit too much complexity for our purposes. So anyway, now let's go to the judgment step. For the judgment, I'm gonna be considering 6 principles of art to base myself here for my final judgment call. Those will be movement, unity, contrast, emphasis, balance, and proportion. There's a lot of different ideas around the principles of art. I'm gonna be considering mostly the ideas that I have seen on Wikipedia at one point that were based on the book of what was it? I forgot the name of the designer. Adam. I'll have to check that. If you're curious, ask me on the comments. But it was Adam something, the designer, who wrote a book about it, and to him he considered like 5 of the 6 principles of art, and I think he was missing movement, and I think Wikipedia also. Through my studies, I believe that makes more sense. Anyway, let's go. Principles of art. Let's begin with movement, since it's the different one anyway, the odd one out. Which is not about animation. Remember, it's about how a work of art can move your eyes around some sort of path or direction. So, for the principle of movement here, I think more strongly on the roots and branches. So, accomplished through their shapes and forms, as often it's the case for the principle of movement. Also, I would say the color here helps, basically because it's continuous. And the texture on this branch specifically, I think it helps a bit. On this one it doesn't. Also, on this one it's kind of neutral, I would say, for the texture. So maybe this one I think the textures are helping a bit. So on some of the branches' roots the textures are helping, some not. But for their lengthy forms and shapes and the continuity of color, I think that's helping convey the movement to me. Other than that, I think there is also a smaller one on the spikes, just because of their geometry, their shapes specifically, like pointy-like shapes. And again, I guess color and value perhaps are helping a bit this time, and texture. The forms, and also the forms, I guess. I guess that's mostly it. That's mostly it. So, does any of that help with the idea of a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy V? Specifically, I don't know. The movement here. You could say that, like, it's kind of. I was thinking like big, but I wonder how much that really ties to the movement specifically here. I don't know. I was also thinking about the spikes, like the principle of movement makes us focus on them. They could be menacing, but not all bosses or enemies on Epic Battle 5 are menacing. We have stuff like the slimes, which are kind of cute, you know. And for bosses, we have like the Chibi Knight, for example, or what else? Don't think I have it right now, but there's gonna be a very cute boss later on. Even the arcade bosses, some of that are kind of cute, you know, the Bosch, for example. So I don't know. I think. Welcome to the Stream Review. I think the best I can think of here is that I think value is helping a bit actually convey the principle of movement now that I think about it, because the shadows on the roots here are kind of accompanying the extent of it. I guess we could say that the value is helping a bit with the principle of movement. At least on this root, on this branch, on this one less I think. But on this one it's kind of like there's the light side and the dark side. And that ties to the game design of Epic Battle Fantasy V, because the enemies are always on the right side of the screen when you fight, and there being there is like brightness to one side and darkness to the other ties to that. So I guess this is working well for that idea. Okay, so what about the notion that what was it? This is a tree. Is the principle of movement helping? Easy, right? Because if there is movement on the roots and the branches, then that naturally guides our eyes to see features typical of trees. So that idea is well communicated thus. Easy. What about the notion that the idea of this being something scary, a spooky boss enemy thing? The roots and the branches I don't think help too much, but as I said, I do think I see a little bit of the principle of movement on the spikes, and those are like spooky, menacing features, traits. I think they help a bit convey the horror and of the Telperion, especially also because the cobwebs are on the spikes. I think that also helps. So principle of movement helping with conveying horror. And finally, what was the last one? The idea for this to be a cat gang hideout thing. For the principle of movement, I don't think I see it. We have like, okay, the roots and the branches and the spikes, but does any of that communicate the idea of ninjas and or hideout or cats? And I don't think I see it anyway, without getting too crazy and creating a whole story about it, let's say. So yeah, so let's move on to the principle of unity / variety, which is all about, parts of the artwork apparently working together, unity, or the opposite of that, variety. So I think the continuity and repetition of the brown is pretty strong for unity. There is repetition both on the bark of it and the branches and roots and inside the hole, so easy, unity there. Also repetition on the shapes and forms of the spikes, relatively, right? They're not like perfect, those would be like rhythms in the shapes and forms, we could say, visually. But that's an example of unity there also. Also something similar for the colors and textures and the shapes of the stumps and the cut-off parts of the Telperion. What else? There's like a lot of unity in different ways. We could talk about variety. For example, the hole itself is a source of variety. There is nothing like it with the forms of it. It's like pretty unique there. Even the spikes have a degree of variety to them. This one, for example, is probably the most varied one. It's like crossed or something. And what else? Also the very varied way that the cut-off parts are distributed also is a source of variety. But yeah, the position of them, I would say, I guess. Also, I just realized we have like the tails of the branches that also help add variety, like this part here, this part here, this part here, this part here. So shapes and a bit of forms. I think it's a bit harder to see their forms, but I think it's there also. So yeah, those are examples of unity and variety. Does any of that help of the idea of a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy V? Not sure. Anything specific for Epic Battle Fantasy V here through all the unity and variety? I don't know, like unity usually is very easy to tie to the creative vision, but to be something specific for Epic Battle Fantasy V, I don't know. We could try to look at the idea of the shadows again, and I suppose there is continuity in the shadows at the back of it, but I don't know. It's a bit of. I think it's a bit like pushing, maybe perhaps. Okay, now let's be fair here. There is continuity on the shadows, on the back part. There is it proximity? There is like a specific part with shadows there, and vice versa, a specific part with light in front. So it's not like completely random, a bunch of different shadows, like something's casting shadow over it. And so there being unity in the placement of the shadows, I suppose I can't ignore that. And so also helping with the idea of the game design of FK battle. Bosses are always on the right side, and the source of light is on the middle of the battlefield, let's say. So yeah, a bit sad that I don't, as I mentioned, it's not the strongest source of unity or variety to me, but it's there, so I can't ignore it. What about the idea of a tree? Easy, right? The bark, the color of the bark. There's also a lot of repetition of the textures of it. I didn't mention, but previously I said rugged textures, right? Which is also, I think, are close to the textures of a bark of a tree. And the textures on the stumps being repeated also very easily similarity to the stumps of trees, so easy there. What about they did something spooky? Again, I mentioned repetition on the spikes, on their shapes and forms and color and textures, and also mentioned the variety of this spike. For example, all of that I think help us again notice the spikes, and all of that it was deliberate. That's the conclusion that we get. If we can make out there is a principle of art there, then it was a deliberate choice of the author, because the principles are how the elements were used, you know. So, as I always remind you guys. So yeah, unity / variety also helping with conveying horror. And finally, what about the idea of a cat hideout for the Ninja Cat Gang? So through everything I said, I don't see much conveying the idea that there are cat ninjas. There are cat ninjas living there. But I did mention the variety of the hole specifically, which is unique forms. The shapes not so much, right? Because there are similar shapes here for this stamp, and there's a lot of circular and oval shapes throughout. But the forms of it and the use of space, the hollow forms, the way the space is laid about there, that's unique. And so, also considering the context, I think it's easy to convey that this could be like the entrance of a hideout. Also, if you think about the size of it, considering the shapes and forms of the circular shape of the whole of the Telperion and the spherical form of it, I believe that could also be a hideout for a cat gang, I guess. Not necessarily for a cat gang, just a hideout, I suppose, but still, it's there. Since the way I have laid about the creative vision was a hideout for a Ninja Cat Gang, I didn't separate like a hideout and something about a Ninja Cat Gang, so I'll be considering that this is helping that idea of the creative vision. What else? I think that's it for Unity. Let's talk about contrast. So, contrast, how about the differences? I think easily to me it's on the colors. Is it the strongest one? I guess the colors, the textures also I think contribute to me with contrast. Like, let's be more specific, right? The colors basically the darker shades of the brown for the bark of the wood, in contrast with the shades of white for the spikes and the tree stumps. That's where I see some strong contrast there. Also in their textures, because it's very well placed, right? The spikes have a very specific textures and a color that differs from the bark, which also has a specific texture. The spikes are like bony textures, the bark some rugged textures, and the cut off stumps and parts of it also have a pattern texture, which is again, all of that helps to add contrast, like placing different things contrasting with each other in different through different elements of art. What else? I would say that's mostly it for contrast, to me at least. There are like smaller ones. As I was mentioning, like there is variety on the use of space and the forms of the entrance and the hole. There's some contrast there with the rest also naturally, since that's the only part of that specific those specific forms and space. So even though, like I mentioned, there is some other space underneath the Telperion and some other space in the hollow part of it, but I still think the use of space is applied differently. So anyway, does any of that I said for contrast, how does that tie to the idea of a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy V? Again, I don't think it helps that much. But if you're gonna look at smaller sources of contrast, let's say, easily you can think about the contrast between light and darkness, right? Much like there is unity in like all this darkness on this back and underneath part of the Telperion, there's unity there, and then there's the bright part on the other side. There is some contrast between light and darkness there, which you already would expect contrast from light and darkness in the first place, right? So again, not where I see contrast most strongly, but since there's some there, I suppose that is helping communicate the creative vision that this could be this is an enemy that is tied to the game design of Epic Battle Fantasy V. So yeah. What else? What about they did This Is a Tree. They did that This Is a Tree, so the contrast there, yeah, I guess it's also helping, right? Because if we're focusing on the bark in contrast with the patterns of the, especially this part, the spikes not so much, but the contrast between the pattern stumps and cut off parts and the bark in color and the textures, I believe that's helping communicate to us that this is a tree. So if there was not this pattern thing, for example, not sure we would get that from contrast, you know, because like when we were talking about movement, the roots and the branches helped us convey that, but now we are seeing a different part of it conveying that this is a tree and through a different principle, so I think that's interesting. So yeah, the contrast there is helping communicate that this is a tree as I see it. What about the idea of this being a spooky monster, something spooky, horror genre, stuff like that? I guess we could go for a similar logic for the spikes, right? Since there is some contrast with the spikes and the bark of the tree. In this case, I think the colors help also, because a darker shade for the bark, darker shade of brown for the bark of the tree, I think is like darker colors closer to horror, maybe, I guess. On Western cultures, that's typical for black to be associated with spooky stuff, and so by extent darker colors. But yeah, I guess that's my read on it. And either way, if we ignore the idea of a darker shade of brown in any case, especially if we, for example, compare it to the Laurelie, the spikes again, there's some contrast with the spikes and the darker shade of the bark. And spikes, I think, are spooky, are like monsters, especially on a tree. What are spikes doing on a tree, you know? That's kind of like monstrous, perhaps, for a tree. And the important part is that the contrast is helping us notice that, helping to communicate that. That's how I see it. And finally, what about the idea of a cat hideout? Again, since there is some contrast between the forms of the hollow hole and the space and the rest of it, I think it help communicate a bit. Although in this time I don't see the contrast helping with the idea of the whole size of it, as I talked about for Unity. you know, unity slash variety. The contrast would only help convey to me that this is like an entrance to the insides of the Telperion. I don't know how well that communicates that this is a hideout, honestly. It could, I guess, because of the size of the hole, perhaps I would say. Like an entrance to a cavern or something, perhaps. I don't know. Naturally, the context helps a lot, and stuff like the description, you kinda get it, you know, just reading it. But maybe it's visually also being well communicated well enough. At least that's gonna be my call here for this critique. Let's talk about a different principle of art now. Let's talk about the principle of emphasis. So, which is about like some part of the artwork focusing your eyes there, bring your focus to it. And if you think about it as hierarchy, as some authors do, then you think about more than one. So there will be like a higher point, then a second one, then a second one, the hierarchy of visual importance, let's say. So for emphasis, I do see like different points of emphasis here. Like the three, I see three of them. Those would be like the entrance, the gaping hole of the Telperion, this gaping hole, this very thick cut-off stump, specifically this one. There are others, but this one specifically, and the spikes. All three of them, to me, bring emphasis to themselves. If we're gonna call this hierarchically, I'm not sure which one would be most emphatic. Perhaps the spikes, also because the outside of the hole and the stump has some similarities in their forms. You know, the inside is still hollow, but yeah, I'm gonna guess this. I'm gonna say the spike is at the top of the visual hierarchy, and below that the stump and the gaping hole. And then there's the rest of the art after those things. Yeah. So anyway, not sure which one would I place above the other when it comes between the stump and the hole, but I don't think that matters too much. Let's see. So does any of that help with conveying that this is a boss for Battle Fantasy V? I think not. This time I don't see it tying to the light and darkness. Don't get me wrong, there is some light and darkness on the spike, but it's very hard to notice it. Unlike if you look at the hole looking for emphasis and contrast. And I don't think that shadow is helping with the emphasis, it's mostly the shapes and forms and a bit of color to me. You know, a little bit of the elements that help with contrast. So, and the other parts I don't even see the shadows that well. On the whole, there is kind of a shadow on this downward part of it, so that does not tie to the game design in any way specifically. So yeah, I don't think I see clues that this is for the emphasis. I don't buy the emphasis, I guess. I don't think I see clues that this is a boss for BF5. What about the idea that this is a tree? Basically the stump, right? I guess there is also some trees with holes in it, you know, and they become the layers of animals like squirrels or stuff, and where squirrels place their nuts or something, I don't know. But whether or not that would make sense for this one, for this part of the art, the stump I think is a very easy giveaway. There being emphasis in it through the forms, the shapes not so much I would say. But to me what's giving emphasis to the stump are the forms, the color and the textures of it. And so yeah, easily, like, again, traits of a tree, you know, tree stumps have this pattern, so easily communicating this is a tree. What about the idea of a horror, something spooky, monster? Again, I'm gonna talk about the spikes. If there is emphasis on the spikes, then I think that easily ties to something scary, to a monster, to something around that context, that set of ideas. So easily the emphasis is helping there. And finally, what about a cat hideout? I guess we arrived at the logic of the exit of it again. The gaping hole of it. And again, although I don't see the size of the Telperion as a whole helping for emphasis, but I guess again the gaping hole is good enough for it, I would say. I'm thinking something like, if this hole was a bit smaller, maybe it would still, you know, could be, let's say, could be conceptually the hideout for a Ninja Cat gang. But I don't think it would be visually that well communicated, but being a very big one, I think to me helps communicate that this is an entrance to a bigger structure. So that's my logic here, at least. Anyway, so that's it for emphasis. So what about there are two principles left. We have the principle of, what was it? Balance. Let's talk about balance. Balance, which is all about some state of equilibrium or tension in the artwork. Do we see it somewhere? Is it balanced or unbalanced visually? Let's see here. I'm getting... Now that I think about it, a lot of stuff is similar to my art critique for Laureline Light, right? But perhaps that can be helped. But anyway, I'm going to say for the principle of balance that I see tension on the roots and branches, especially on the roots that seem to be lifting the Telperion, and also a bit on the branches maybe they're also helping. Mostly there. The rest, I think it's in equilibrium, but there is tension on the roots and branches, and that's basically it, I guess. So does any of that tie to the idea of a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy V? I talked about the shadows and light when I was talking about movement, right? But I'm not sure that's helping convey the tension here. I think it's mostly the placement and thus the shapes and forms of it, and the texture. Could the value here, the light and shadows, be helping convey a bit of the tension? Maybe actually, maybe. I'm thinking, for example, this shadow here. But it's weird, because maybe we're getting a bit, maybe we're overthinking this right now. The important part is, here would be like the shape of the shadows, that would be what's helping convey tension. Not sure if the placement of it matters, I don't know. I'm gonna have to adjudicate here for this. I'm going to say that the shadows helping conveying the tension, I would say. And I guess I will say that that's helping the creative vision of Boss Battle Fantasy. I will say that because we can see that the shadows are from the right, I think we could like switch up. There could be shadows in front, helping convey tension and brightness to the back of it. But here's the opposite, and so it's tied to the game design of Epic Battle Fantasy. I could be totally wrong on this one. I could be just like overthinking this, but that's gonna be my judgment call for this part of the critique here. So yeah, helping with that idea. What about a tree? Is the tension helping with the idea that this is a tree? Funny enough, I wouldn't say so. Let's... I was thinking like, but branches and roots in real life do not necessarily evoke tension, but whatever, right? Because in any case, there being visual tension on the roots and branches, I think are obviously making us notice traits of a tree. So yeah. let's try to keep it simple. What about the idea of something spooky, something of the horror genre, some sort of monster perhaps? This time I think not. I think we would have to go on a tangent or create a whole chain of thought to justify it. But just the idea of there being tension on the roots and branches of this, I think it's not enough to say to communicate horror. So I'm gonna say it's not helping. And finally, what about the idea of hideout for the Ninja Cat gang? Also don't see it. Again, you would have to make a very long string of ideas. Perhaps not like the longest, but I think it's long enough, let's say, string of ideas. I don't think it's just communicated by itself without the whole conjecture of the viewer. Whole set of conjectures, I guess. So yeah, I don't think the balance is helping with that. Also end of string time, but we're at the end of it. Finally, the last principle is the principle of proportion, the last principle I need to talk about. So we're going to be looking at the sizes of the different parts of the artwork and also to their dimensions. So for example, we can talk about how the spherical forms, circular shapes of the body of the Telperion have some bigger proportions there. That to me is the part of the biggest proportion there. After that, we have stuff like the gaping hole, this stump, and so on and so forth. And then things get a bit weird because it's kind of unfair, you would say, to compare the hole and the stump with the branches and the roots. I would say that they have like dimensions, are very long in dimension but a bit shorter on their thickness. Shorter at least than the stump and the hole. What else for notable dimensions and proportions here? And I guess I would say the spikes have like smaller sizes than the stumps and the hole. If you just... and not any noticeable dimension, I would say. Too noticeable to me, you know. It's mostly, the pointy parts is more about their shapes and forms, not the dimensions per se. At least not compared to stuff like the roots and branches. So yeah, that's how I see the proportions here. And I guess I would also mention that even smaller than the spikes are the many cut-off parts of it. So yeah. So with all that said, does any of that help, as I see it, convey the idea that this is a boss for Epic Battle Fantasy V? The proportions, the dimensions... Perhaps if you think just about the size, we could have an argument that this is a boss for a game. But I'm not sure if I would go there. I don't know. Yeah, maybe. Let's just say, like, I think the sizes have conveyed that this is a boss, but not necessarily an enemy. Because there, you know, could this be a player character, or could this be more specifically something like my Mighty Oak that's part of her limit break, you know? There's the size, I don't think it's enough. Where is it? Here. Just the size, I don't think it's enough. But I guess it could help convey the idea this is a boss. So there's that. It's helping with, in that sense, with the creative vision. What about the idea that this is a tree? So for the sizes and the proportions of it, specifically I suppose the dimensions of the roots and the branches follow the dimensions of roots and branches of trees in general. Most of the branches. I believe the roots are very unique. They look more like branches that got underground, I would say. At least from what I'm used to seeing for trees. But I would say the branches are there and the roots are not too far off. So I would say that the proportions here are helping. with that idea, that part of the creative vision. So if we're going to think about when I say the dimensions, specifically you can think about the sizes of the the length in comparison to the girth, stuff like that, when it comes to the shapes and forms. So anyway, what about the notion that this is a horror, this is a monster, something of the horror genre, something spooky? I did mention that the spikes have kind of their own scale of things, Sure, that's something that I believe helps can help the creative vision. When there's something with a very specific size, there's not necessarily even the bigger one, if something unique in size, and that helps helps communicate the same thing. In this case, I think the spikes are the only thing I see with its scale, the way I'm grouping it. I would consider the gaping hole and the stump as something on a higher scale, and the small cut-off parts something on a smaller scale, and the rest is something even farther. So I would say like the spikes having its own size helps a bit call attention to them, and as I said before, spikes I see very easily as something scary or something that can be scary, spooky, especially these ones for their textures and the forms and shapes, which is a bit jagged, these spikes. So yeah, so those I think the proportions are helping with that. And finally, what about the idea of a cat hideout? For the proportions, I don't see it. When I talked about the gaping hole, which is... I think we have something here. I was just going to say that the gaping hole has the same, to me, size relatively to the stump, so I wouldn't say they are helping convey the same thing for their sizes. But indeed, there is the big size of the body of the Telperion, which, for the proportion, especially comparing to the hole, which could be like the entrance of a house does for their sizes. So I think easily that could be help conveying that this is some sort of hideout. For a ninja cat gang, not necessarily. For a cat, for a bunch of cats maybe, but not necessarily. But being a hideout, I think it's communicated that this could be some sort of hideout. So, and with the help of context especially, I think it's all going well. You can think imagine if there was no entrance, for example. It would be weird to call this a hideout. You would kind of be wondering how, is it really a hideout or stuff? Or maybe if it was just a gaping hole, but it was all hollow inside and with many holes or something, I don't know. It was not a spherical or form or circular shape, That kind of stuff I think would make it harder to convey, or maybe impossible to me to convey the idea of a hideout, but that's my logic here. So proportion is helping. And with all that said, the final judgment call here is, I can make it. Basically, each part of the creative vision was conveyed through the principles, in at least one principle. And so the only reasonable conclusion here is for me to call this a successful work of art. Congrats, Matt. Think you pulled it off in conveying everything you wanted to convey, if my interpretation is correct. Good job, mate. Good game design. So that was it for today. Join me next week for more content. Next Friday, if you want to watch me play and critique a Battle Fantasy, or Monday and through Thursday if you want to Team Fortress 2. Either way, see you next time. Bye!